President, I congratulate Switzerland on assuming the presidency of the Security Council for this month, and I thank Slovenia for its work as the presidency of last month. I thank France for requesting this emergency meeting. I also thank Secretary General Guterres for his briefing. On this occasion, I would like to reiterate China's resolute support for the SG for his work and oppose the groundless accusations of Israel against him. President, over the past 2 weeks, the situation in the Middle East, in particular in Lebanon, has taken a sharp turn for the worse. Following the remotely operated and simultaneous detonation of thousands of communications devices in Lebanon, Israel carried out several rounds of large-scale airstrikes in southern and eastern Lebanon. Yesterday, Israel launched ground offensive and military incursion into Lebanon. Israel also launched intensive airstrikes against Syria. Iran has also concluded a series of military attacks on the military and security targets in Israel and sent correspondence to the Security Council explaining its position. China is deeply concerned and extremely worried about the current grave situation and the prospect for further developments. We call for effective respect for the sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity of all states. We reiterate our opposition to all acts that violate the basic norms of international relations and condemn all violence and attacks against civilians. We share the position of the United Nations that any Israeli crossing into Lebanon violates the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Lebanon and contravenes the provisions of the Security Council Resolution 1701. Since last October, the cycle of violent conflict has been repeating itself in the Middle East. Israel, in total disregard for the call of the international community for an immediate ceasefire, single-mindedly advances its military operations, resulting in the projection and expansion of the conflict. At present, an all-out war is on the verge of breaking out. At this critical juncture, any inflammatory statements and provocative actions are extremely dangerous and could easily lead to miscalculations and chain reactions, escalate the situation, or even make it completely out of control. We urge all parties, in particular Israel, to exercise restraint and refrain from any action that could lead to further escalation of the situation. President, the conflict has caused an unprecedented humanitarian disaster. As we have seen, Gaza has become an inferno on earth, while in Lebanon there has been a great deal of destruction of civilian facilities, thousands of casualties, and more than 1 million people displaced from their homes, including a large number of Palestinian refugees. We call on all parties to the conflict to respect the red lines of international humanitarian law and to protect civilians. We support the efforts of the UN humanitarian system to take urgent action to ease the humanitarian situation in Palestine and Lebanon. China reiterates the importance of respecting the neutrality of UNIFIL and of effectively ensuring the safety and security of the peacekeepers. United Nations assets and personnel should not be the target of armed attacks. President, the Security Council bears an important responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. Under the current circumstances, the Council must act urgently and be united in making demands clearly and unequivocally that an immediate ceasefire must be established in Gaza. The de-escalation of the violence must be stopped, and the de-escalation of the Lebanese and Israeli situation must be advanced. The cycle of violence must be halted. Every effort must be made to prevent the spread of the fighting, and the parties concerned must be pushed to return to the track of political and diplomatic solutions. Any rhetorics that appease and allow further military adventurism will send out wrong signals and may cause serious consequences. We hope that major countries with important influence will adopt a sincere and responsible attitude and earnestly play a more constructive role and avoid further turmoil of the situation. I thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China, and I give the floor to the representative of Ecuador. Thank you, Madam President. Allow me first and foremost to congratulate your delegation on assuming the presidency of the Council for this month, and I reiterate the full support of my country. We'd also like to thank Slovenia for the excellent presidency of the Council last month. I'd like to stress and reiterate the support of my country to the work of the Secretary-General for peace and our support for all UN agencies in that regard. So thank you, Madam President, and I'd like to thank France for having requested this emergency meeting so that the Council can consider the worsening situation in Lebanon and Israel, recent developments that have placed the Middle East in an extremely vulnerable situation. Thank you, Secretary-General, for the sobering information that you have provided us with and your call to the international community to mobilize the more than $400 million in humanitarian assistance that Lebanon requires at this time, and above all, for your permanent commitment to a de-escalation of the conflict and a ceasefire. We should begin by recalling that we are just 5 days away from the anniversary of the terrorist attacks by Hamas, which have no justification and must be condemned, that gave rise to the current spiral of violence that we're seeing in the region. The Palestinian cause cannot be used by Hezbollah and other extremist groups to try to, in vain, explain their acts of terrorism, such as the killing of children while they were playing football in Mahd al-Shams last July. Ecuador recognizes the imminent right to self-defense of member states of the United Nations in case of an armed attack in terms outlined in Article 51 of the Charter. We must put an end to the escalation of violence that has been described, which includes air bombings and incursions, the launching of rockets, ballistic missiles, acts of terrorism that continue to expose innocent civilians to loss of life and limb. In Gaza, we've seen tens of thousands of civilian deaths, including women and children. The states involved, international humanitarian law must be respected. Humanitarian workers must be able to fulfill their work and their lives must be respected. The states involved and regional organizations and the international community as a whole must deploy all diplomatic and political strategies possible to bring about a cessation of hostilities. This responsibility is greater for those that have a greater degree of influence over the parties to the conflict. Now is the time to take specific decisions aimed at achieving agreements that will lead to a lasting and sustainable peace. Resolutions 1701, 1559, 2722 and 2735 of the Security Council must be complied with without delay, since non-compliance constitutes a violation of international law. We must avoid another humanitarian disaster, leaving those who desire more violence without any excuse. Madam President, colleagues, Ortega and Gasset said, "It is false to say that in life circumstances decide. On the contrary, circumstances are the dilemma in the face of which we must make decisions. Who takes the decision is our character. Neither our collective responsibility in the Council nor peace, which constitutes a high value of humanity, can be subordinated to geopolitical tensions and interests. In conclusion, I reiterate that Ecuador supports all initiatives which have as their goal the restoration of peace and the sustainability of that peace." Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ecuador. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as a representative of Switzerland. We would like to thank the Secretary General for his statement. Switzerland is extremely concerned about the recent developments in the Middle East. The risk of a regional war that we have been warning of for almost a year now is about to become reality. In view of the countless civilian lives at risk, it is imperative that all actors in the region immediately cease hostilities to allow for de-escalation and that the Council fully plays its role. The intensification of hostilities between Israel and Hezbollah, including reports of Israeli ground incursions and the firing of some 200 ballistic missiles by Iran into Israeli territory, are unacceptable. The same applies to the offensives carried out by the Houthis and other armed groups in the region. All these attacks must stop immediately. Switzerland condemns this spiral of violence in the recent weeks. It is endangering the lives of civilians throughout the region. Tens of thousands of civilians have been killed, including countless children. Several million have been forcibly displaced because of the hostilities. The civilian population is paying a heavy price for this military escalation in Lebanon, throughout the occupied Palestinian territory, and in Israel. Dialogue is the only way to avoid a regional war. Switzerland supports all efforts to find diplomatic solutions leading to an immediate end to the violence throughout the region. All parties, and those who have influence over them, must now show maximum restraint. Switzerland calls on all parties to act within the limits imposed by international law, including the United Nations Charter. The sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries in the region must be respected. In addition, the will of this Council is clear. All of its resolutions must be implemented. This applies to the resolutions demanding a ceasefire in Gaza and calling for the immediate and unconditional release of the hostages. It also applies to the resolutions on the maritime security in the Red Sea. Similarly, we once again urge a return to a cessation of hostilities on both sides of the Blue Line, as well as an immediate recommitment to the implementation of Resolution 1701. This resolution is recognized by one and all. It sets out a path for resolving the underlying causes of the conflict and enabling the population of Lebanon and Israel to live in peace and security. International humanitarian law must be respected by all parties in all circumstances and irrespective of the lawfulness of the use of force. This includes strict compliance with the principles relating to the conduct of hostilities, such as a distinction between civilians and combatants, proportionality, and precaution. Switzerland condemns all violations of international law that have taken place in recent days, including yesterday's ballistic attacks by Iran on Israel. Switzerland also condemns all violations of international humanitarian law. We also condemn all violence against civilians, such as yesterday's act of terror in Jaffa and the increasing attacks by settlers in the West Bank. Secretary General, Switzerland reiterates its support for the UN's commitment and good offices in the region. This applies in particular to UNIFIL and UNSCOL. UNIFIL, to which Switzerland contributes through UNSO, is currently working in an extremely dangerous environment so as to reduce tensions and ensure liaison between the parties. Switzerland also reiterates its full support for the work of the Secretary General. In addition, the UN, in collaboration with other organizations, is currently providing humanitarian aid to all civilians in need. We reiterate our call for the protection of UN personnel, in particular humanitarian and peacekeeping personnel. There is an urgent need to put an end to the suffering of the civilian population and to re-establish dialogue in order to bring peace to the region. The responsibility of a Security Council, united in its action for peace, is clear. I thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative under Rule 37. And I invite Lebanon to take the floor.
Madam President, at the outset, I congratulate you on assuming the presidency of the Security Council for this month. I also thank Slovenia for its presidency of the Council during September. I would also like to thank France for requesting to hold this emergency meeting. I would also thank the Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Antonio Guterres, for his briefing and his calls. We express our solidarity with him and we support him and his efforts. Madam President, we gather today in your august council as the Middle East region is burning from all sides. Lebanon is not doing well. Gaza is not doing well, as military Israeli forces and rows of battle tanks and armored vehicles are all along the southern borders of Lebanon. The Israeli government and its cabinet have ratified the ground invasion of Lebanon, which has started last night. This follows 11 months of a barbaric aggression that spared no civilians, no eyewitnesses, no aid workers, no journalists, no children, no women, and no elderly. Since the 8th of October 2023, Israel has killed and injured thousands of people in a blatant violation of UN Charter, international law, and international humanitarian law, and all international norms and humanitarian principles. Therefore, what Israel is claiming that this is merely limited surgical military operations, this is untrue. The damages to civilians and the civilian infrastructure are immense. What took place in Ain ad-Dilb village demonstrates just that. An Israeli strike on the 29th of September targeted a residential building, causing a massacre and killing 71 victims, including dozens of women and children, all buried in a mass grave. This tragedy recalls previous Israeli massacres during its previous invasions and attacks on Lebanon, particularly the two Qana massacres of 1996 and 2006. Israel has reaffirmed time and again its utter disregard for international law, despite the calls from all members of the Security Council in general and Switzerland especially on Israel to abide by its obligations under international humanitarian law. Madam President, words and complaints have lost their meaning. How many times have we come before this Council and warned of the catastrophic situation along the southern borders? How many times have we sounded the alarm that this war could become a regional war that includes many fronts? What is happening today, this unprecedented level of killing, displacement, and destruction, this can no longer be tolerated or ignored. The policy of putting our heads in the sand and facing a confrontation with Israel is no longer useful. The children of the south and the southern suburb of Beirut are sleeping on the streets. Mothers are carrying their children, fleeing the horrors of the destructive strikes and missiles used against civilians. Israel has intensified its aggression and its crimes against Lebanon and its capital, Beirut. In one day alone, on the 23rd of September, Israel, through its aerial bombardments, killed 569 people, including 50 children and 94 women. They've also assassinated the Secretary General of Hezbollah, His Eminence Mr. Hassan Nasrallah, on the 27th of September. Across history, there was never consensus for a standard description for any military, political, or revolutionary individual. And history is rich with examples of these individuals. Your council here today is divided over a correct description. However, there is consensus among everyone that confronting an occupying force is resistance. Madam President, as we have said time and again, and as His Excellency the Prime Minister has said in his statement before this Council last week, and as the Foreign Minister of Lebanon has repeated once and again, The people of Lebanon and the government of Lebanon reject the war. They want the implementation of Resolution 1701 with all its provisions. They want to deploy the Lebanese army in the south along our ground borders with the support of UNIFIL. This is the only solution for this blind war and this barbaric aggression. We have expressed our willingness to strengthen the presence of the army in the south, and the government has announced that it has opened the door for the enlistment of 1,500 new soldiers to comply with the implementation of Resolution 1701. In this regard, I recall that Lebanon has agreed to the French-American initiative that Israel has also initially agreed to, but then rejected this initiative, even annihilated it with a wave of killing and destruction that has been unprecedented in scale and violence. We also reaffirmed the official position as stated by the Prime Minister yesterday. We remain committed to the call issued by the American and French presidents, supported by a number of friendly and sisterly countries. We pledge to implement all the points of the declaration, including an immediate ceasefire, to start to look into the implementation of Resolution 1701 fully. We welcome the call and we pledge to implement it immediately. And upon a ceasefire, we are prepared to deploy the Lebanese army to the area south of the Litani River so that it can carry out its function fully in coordination with UNIFIL in the south. Madam President, today we are moving further and further towards an open, unrestricted regional war. The solution is to go back to political solutions based on relevant resolutions of international legitimacy. This situation will not be resolved until the full implementation of Resolution 1701, and if we only focus on imposing military solutions instead of diplomatic solutions. Furthermore, the situation in Palestine will not be resolved and will only escalate, and the waves of killing and destruction will continue unless resolutions of the United Nations are implemented, particularly resolutions 2735, 242, 338 on the two-state solutions and the establishment of the Palestinian state. The Security Council must shoulder its responsibility to prevent an implosion in the Middle East and to help us exit this dark tunnel. Madam President, Lebanon today is facing an unprecedented humanitarian crisis. Lebanon needs urgent humanitarian assistance. It is the only state that hosts 2 million Syrian IDPs, 500,000 Palestinian refugees, and we also have around 1 million Lebanese IDPs. This is an unusual precedent. We have warned before of the risk of displacement, and today we are before a humanitarian crisis with 1 million IDPs, with thousands of them on the streets, without food, without water, without medication. Therefore, we are requiring assistance to confront this catastrophe. Yesterday, in cooperation with the United Nations, we launched an urgent appeal for $426 million to respond to this humanitarian crisis. We would like to thank all those who contributed to the aid efforts, from friendly and sisterly countries, from UN agencies, and we call on all stakeholders and all countries to contribute as well. Madam President, our history with Israel has been permeated with many invasions in 1978, 1982, and 2006. And all these invasions, all these occupations that resulted in great devastation, the killing of thousands of civilians, they all ended with the defeat and withdrawal of Israel. Today's invasion will have the same result: another defeat to be added to the record of Israel with Lebanon. The land of the South recognizes its citizens, and our citizens in the South are rooted in their land. The olive tree that you burned with your white phosphorus will grow, will blossom, and bear fruit once again, and this consecrated land will reject any occupier for however long it takes. Madam President, Lebanon today is stuck between the Israeli destruction machine and the ambitions of others in the region. The Lebanese people rejects this fatal formula. Lebanon deserves life. Lebanon deserves life. Yes, Lebanon and the Lebanese people deserve life. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Lebanon, and I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Madam President. Last night, the Iranian regime launched a cold-blooded attack against 10 million civilians, Jewish, Muslim, Christian, men, women, and children of every faith. In an unprecedented act of aggression, Iran fired almost 200 ballistic missiles, forcing millions of people into bomb shelters. These scenes have not been witnessed since the Blitz in London. This was a deliberate attempt to strike at the very heart of our society, targeting the most sacred places in Israel, holy sites, mosques, synagogues, and churches. To Iran, there is no holy ground, no purity of life worth protecting. But even before the missiles rained down, the bloodshed had already begun. Just minutes before this assault, Palestinian terrorists opened fire on civilians, murdering 7 innocent people, young women, mothers protecting their babies, tourists. This is the reality we face every single day. Terror at our borders, missiles overhead, bullets in our streets. The Council must understand the situation Israel is forced to live in. We are under attack. This was not just an escalation. It was a direct assault on our very existence. The world watched silently as Iran funded and directed attacks against us for the past year, arming and training their proxies for decades, and the international community sat quiet. The silence, the routine call for de-escalation, only emboldened Iran. The result, last night's onslaught. Now the world must step up. Iran must pay a heavy price for this attack. Anything less is complicity. Do not be fooled by the fact that Israeli air defenses performed near miracles last night, saving countless lives beyond imagination. We also appreciate our partners for their assistance in defending against Iran's attack. Iran's failure does not diminish the evil behind their actions, the intentions. What we witnessed was nothing short of pure, unrestrained evil. This is the largest missile assault in Israel's history. They have openly launched hundreds of missiles into civilian areas. Today, the mask is off, and their evil is now laid bare for all the world to see. The Ayatollah's regime has revealed its true nature, not just as the world's greatest sponsor of terror, but as an active, direct aggressor. For years, Iran has armed terrorists and tyrannical regimes. We all know their weapons are responsible for the deaths of countless innocent civilians all across the globe, from Europe's war zones to terror attacks in the Middle East, from embassies in Latin America to assaults on U.S. personnel. There is no corner of the world where Iran's blood-stained fingerprints cannot be found. They are not just Israel's enemy, they are an enemy of all civilized nations, an enemy to their own people who they brutally oppress, and an enemy to all nations they work to destabilize. Until now, they had largely operated in the shadows, using all their proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis. They carried out their dirty work. But last night, that mask was ripped away, the mask that their leaders wear in these very halls. Iran no longer hides behind others. They have proudly stepped into the open, are the architects of chaos and destruction. And now the world can see their true face. Iran launched the largest ballistic missile attack in history, justifying it as a vengeance for the elimination of Hassan Nasrallah. That is the reason. In doing so, they relinquished any deniability and claimed full ownership over Hezbollah's actions. They say that. That is the reason for the attack, because of Nasrallah. So basically, they own the deeds of Hezbollah today. Let me remind you all. Allow me to remind you of some of Hezbollah's crimes against the world. In 1983, they bombed the United States barracks in Beirut, murdering 241 U.S. servicemen. That same year, they bombed the U.S. Embassy in Beirut, murdering 63. In 1992, they bombed the Israeli Embassy in Buenos Aires, killing 29 people and wounding 242. 2 years later, same place, Buenos Aires, they bombed the Jewish Community Center, murdering 85 and injuring over 300. Before 9/11, Hezbollah were responsible for more American deaths than any other terrorist organization. None of this even mentions the thousands of Lebanese people and Syrians that they brutally murdered at the altar of their tyrannical masters. In the past year alone, since October 8th, Hezbollah has launched over 9,000 missiles and rockets, over 1,000 anti-tank missiles and hundreds of attack drones. They have made over 70,000 Israeli civilians refugees in their own country. All the while, they have been attempting to infiltrate our communities to commit an October 7th-style massacre. Behind every murder, every rocket launch, every plot stands the Iranian regime. Let me be clear. Israel will defend itself. We will act. And let me assure you, the consequences Iran will face for their actions will be far greater than they could ever have imagined. Let me ask the Council and the entire world, how would any of you react if faced with such an attack? What would any nation do if hundreds of ballistic missiles were raining down on your civilians, your cities, your places of worship? The scale of this attack is unimaginable, and yet Iran is determined to escalate further. This is not just a threat to Israel, this is a threat to the entire world. We will defend our people, and our response will be swift and decisive. Those who attack us will face serious consequences. For every missile fired, we will respond with strength. For weeks, I have sat in this council warning of the growing threat Iran poses, urging you to take decisive action against this regime. I warned that Iran's desire for dominance would not stop at Israel's border, but the inaction of this council has emboldened them. And now the missiles falling on Israel are the direct result of that failure to act. The time for complacency is over. The Iranian regime has shed all deniability. They are no longer silent puppet masters. They are bloodthirsty aggressors, reveling in their violence and destruction. The world cannot afford to ignore this reality any longer. We demand immediate, crippling sanctions on Iran. The IRGC must be designated as the terrorist organization it is. Do not let yourselves be fooled by moderate Iranian president. I saw the way they were received here last week. The meetings, the clapping. Iran's policy is dictated by its supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. And under his rule, the regime has grown more aggressive and murderous than ever. Iran's true face is one of terror, death, and chaos. They do not care about life, they do not respect their own religion, and they have targeted their fellow Muslims without hesitation. The time for empty calls for de-escalation is over. How can you do that? To equate Israel, a nation simply wishing to live in peace, acting in defense of its people, with an aggressor bent on our destruction is not just wrong. It is a grotesque and immoral distortion of reality. This is not a conflict between two equal sides. This is a battle between a sovereign country defending its right to exist and a regime that seeks nothing less than our extinction. And I repeat what I said last time. We have no border with Iran. We have no dispute with them. Ask yourself why they spend so much money and energy to build those rockets and to attack us. What is the reason behind it? Calls for de-escalation is a false symmetry, an absurd equivalence between the protector and the destroyer. Tonight actually, the Jewish people will welcome the new year. The past year has been the most challenging in our country's history, but we will prevail. In this coming year, we will not stop until all 101 hostages are back at their families' tables. Let the world understand, Israel will defend itself, and will do so with justice and strength. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Israel, and I'll give the floor to the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful, we congratulate you, Madam President, for assuming the presidency of the Security Council this month, and thank you for the convening this emergency meeting to address the ongoing Israeli aggression against Lebanon and critical situation in the region. We acknowledge Slovenia for its successful conclusion of the presidency in September. Madam President, distinguished delegates, for a year now, the apartheid and occupying regime of Israel has continued its brutality in occupied Palestine with full impunity. And now this regime is extending its brutal aggressive war to Lebanon and targeting innocent people day and night across the border and deep inside the territory. The regime is pushing the region to the edge of an all-out unprecedented catastrophe. Israel has no intention to pursue peace or a ceasefire. Regrettably, the UN Security Council has remained paralyzed due to the United States' obstruction of any effective decision by this body. Unwavering support provided by the United States, United Kingdom, and certain Western states to Israel has given a carte blanche to this aggressive terrorist regime for all sorts of sinister behavior. No more than ever, this regime has become a serious threat to international peace and security. The only way to prevent further escalation is clear. Israel must immediately cease its war on Gaza, and its attacks on Lebanon must stop. Madam President, distinguished delegates, as we informed the members of the Council in our letter yesterday, the armed forces of the Islamic Republic of Iran launched a series of missile strikes targeting the military and security positions of the Israeli regime. Iran's action was in full accordance with the inherent right to self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter, and a direct response to the regime's repeated acts of aggression against Iran, including the violation of Iran's sovereignty and territorial integrity during the past months. Our invocation of the right of self-defense, followed by an extended period of restraint, reflects Iran's responsible approach to regional and international peace and security at a time when the illegal action and genocide carried out by this occupying apartheid regime against the Palestinian people, as well as its repeated military aggression against Lebanon and Syria, continue. Iran's missile strikes were a necessary and proportionate response to Israeli continued terrorist aggressive acts over the past 2 months. This includes the violation of Iran's sovereignty, the assassination of political leader of Hamas in Tehran and Iranian citizens, the targeting and wandering Iran's ambassador to Lebanon, and to recent assassination of Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of the resistance and Secretary General of Hezbollah, and General Abbas Nil Furushan, an Iranian military advisor in Beirut. I wish to mention the key facts that clearly demonstrate Iran's action under self-defense is fully justified, lawful, and firmly grounded in international legal principles. On 1st April 2024, Israel presently attacked Iran's diplomatic mission in Damascus, Syria, in a blatant violation of international law, specifically the principle of inviolability of diplomatic and consular premises. Iran immediately sought the Council's condemnation. What was this body's response? Nothing. Rather than condemning Israel's act of aggression, the Council merely called for Iran's restraint and even refrained from issuing a press statement proposed by Russia. After 10 days of silence from the Security Council, Iran has no choice but to use its inherent right under international law to respond to this severe violation. On 31st July 2024, Israel committed yet another act of aggression by assassination Mr. Ismail Haniyeh, Hamas political leader and the former Prime Minister of Palestine, while he was an official guest of the Iranian government in Tehran. This was a flagrant breach of Iran's national sovereignty and territorial integrity. Despite Iran's call for action, the Council again failed to act. Meanwhile, several states, including the United States, urged Iran to maintain restraint, citing ongoing ceasefire negotiations. We respected these calls for diplomacy, yet no ceasefire materialized and Israel only grew bolder. Again, we witnessed another heinous crime by Israel, this time through the detonation of communication devices targeting the innocent people of Lebanon. A larger number of innocent civilians were killed and injured, including Iran's ambassador to Lebanon. This was yet another manifestation of state terrorism. Following, Israel carried out a blatant act of terrorist aggression using US-supplied thousands-pound bunker busters to assassinate Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, and a symbol of resistance against Israeli occupation and aggression in Lebanon. This brutal attack resulted in the martyrdom of numerous innocent people, including Hezbollah leader and Iranian General Abbas Nil Furushan, while also leaving many civilians wounded. This egregious act underscores once more the regime's continued reliance on violence and terror. Madam President, the Islamic Republic of Iran has consistently pursued peace and stability for the region and called for an immediate ceasefire and the cessation of civilians' casualties, a position we have maintained for over a year. Yet, experience has proven that Israel only understands the language of force. Diplomacy has repeatedly failed, as Israel views restraint not as a gesture of goodwill, but as a weakness to exploit. Each act of restraint taken by Iran has only emboldened Israel to commit even greater crimes and more acts of aggression. Consequently, Iran's response was necessary to restore balance and deterrence. Israel must understand that each act of aggression it makes is not unpunished and will be met with consequences. This is the cost this regime must bear. Contrary to the regime which consistently considers innocent civilians and civilian infrastructure as legitimate target for aggression and massacre, Iran's response has only targeted the regime's military and security installation with its defensive missile strike, because the Islamic Republic of Iran is grounded in ethical principles and noble teaching of Islam and full compliance with the principles of distinction under international humanitarian law. Madam President, distinguished delegates, the international community cannot afford to remain silent. We reiterate our call on this Council to respond with urgency and determination. The Security Council must intervene to stop Israeli continued aggression and war crimes against Lebanon, Gaza, and Syria, and to prevent the situation from escalating into a full-scale regional war. Furthermore, the Security Council must force Israel to comply with its obligation on the resolution this body adopted. Israel must fully implement Resolution 1701. Finally, Madam President, we strongly warn against any further act of aggression by Israeli terrorist regime against our national security and vital interests. Iran is fully prepared to take further defensive measures if necessary to protect its legitimate interests and defend its territorial integrity and sovereignty against any act of military aggressions and the illegal use of force. In this regard, Iran will have no hesitation. In conclusion, the regime of the United States and the United Kingdom regime, notorious enablers of the Israeli regime, along with France, have once again cynically attempted to justify Israeli heinous crimes under the guise of self-defense, shifting the blame onto Iran. While the Israeli regime must be held accountable for the atrocity crimes and cannot disregard the U.S. complicity in Israel's crimes. Israel's warmongering relies on U.S. regime, military support, and political backing. American weapons constitute the major part of Israeli weaponry and ammunition used in Gaza, and therefore the United States is implicated in every aspect of Israel's atrocity. The vast majority of bombs Israeli drops on Gaza and Lebanon are U.S.-made. The U.S. regime even provides Israel with jet fuel. The U.S. has sent so many arms to Israel since October 7 that the Pentagon has struggled to find sufficient cargo aircraft to deliver the materials. If there were even a shred of honesty in their concerns for the loss of innocent people lives in Gaza or Lebanon, or for the spread of war across the region, they could easily strip Israel of the tools it used to commit those atrocities, yet their actions reveal their true intent to embolden Israel's criminal actions. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran. I now give the floor to the representative of Iraq to take the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. Allow me to congratulate Switzerland on assuming the presidency of the Council this month. I wish you all success. I also thank Slovenia for its efforts as president of the Council in September. I thank France for calling for this meeting. I would also like to express my deepest gratitude to Mr. Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, for his briefing. We highly value his position and his calls for a ceasefire. Madam President, holding meeting after meeting at the Security Council over the past year without achieving any tangible results to stop continued Israeli attacks against the Palestinian people reflects a painful reality. The reality that the Security Council is not making any effective or resolute decisions to stop these violations that allow the occupation to perpetuate its practices and escalate violence in the region. It is time for the Security Council to play an effective role to maintain international peace and security, especially as Israeli attacks against Palestinian and Lebanese territories persist. The Security Council must bear its primary responsibility of maintaining international peace and security according to the Charter of the United Nations. The Security Council must adopt binding resolutions to ensure an immediate ceasefire, as it did in other conflicts around the world. Failure by Security Council to play its role and to fulfill its responsibility to maintain international peace and security opens the door to Israel to persist in its violations without any real deterrent. This leads to more instability and jeopardizes regional and international peace. The international community and the Security Council in particular needs to re-evaluate its policies towards this conflict. It must take tangible steps to end the occupation and ensure the protection of civilians. Continued violations, the aggression, military expansions, all these actions by Israeli occupation forces without any deterrent pushes the region towards a wide regional confrontation, which jeopardizes regional security, causes significant human suffering, spreads extremism and terrorism, and further complicates the situation. Failure to put an end to these crimes emboldens Israel to go even further with its violations. It emboldens it to launch military attacks. This situation not only aggravates the suffering of the Palestinian and Lebanese people, it also jeopardizes stability and security in the region as a whole. In the absence of any deterrent, the conflict gets worse, and the risk of the region being dragged into a dangerous and widespread conflict increases. Due to the absence of decisive international intervention, the conflict has expanded to include Lebanon, which might lead to an all-out war in the region. Madam President, the accumulation of practices by the occupation forces over the past 75 years, the flagrant violations against the Palestinian people, the occupation of Arab territories in Syria and Lebanon, the repeated attacks, they all constitute a blatant violation of international law and international humanitarian law. These crimes, the massacres, the violence, including the recent unjust attacks on the city of Beirut that claim the lives of thousands of Lebanese, deepen the wounds and aggravate the conflict in the region. The war has entered a very dangerous phase that portends more destruction and killing. It would exceed what we've seen in the past days as occupation forces continue with their genocidal act, with their killings that amount to war crimes and genocide. Occupation forces are disregarding international humanitarian law and human norms, acting impetuously without any deterrent. Occupation forces are trying to find false pretexts to defend the commission of those crimes. Occupation forces are committing crimes of deliberate mass killings of civilians in Gaza and Lebanon and other occupied Arab territories. These crimes are despicable. They reflect the brutality and hostile behavior of occupation forces. The international community is now before a legal, humanitarian, and moral responsibility that tests our common humanity. The international community must state that the war launched on Gaza is not an act of self-defense, as Israel claims. This claim is legally invalid. Israel took the path of vengeance and genocide. This is confirmed by the horrifying numbers of casualties, Palestinian civilians, women, children, the elderly, even UN staff, and their families. This is a dangerous precedent that we've never seen before. The war on Gaza has expanded to include Lebanon. Most recently, we've witnessed an unjust attack that led to the assassination of Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah and other resistance figures. The war can further expand to include other countries in the region. This is a threat to the stability of the Middle East as a whole. This scenario can have grave repercussions that go beyond the borders of local conflicts. We might be seeing a wider escalation that includes mutual attacks, which would be a serious threat to international and regional stability, especially if other regional powers joined this equation, which would invite interventions, international interventions that would further complicate the situation. that would jeopardize political and social stability, that would aggravate humanitarian crisis, that would lead to mass displacement, that would lead to an increase in the number of refugees and IDPs, that would increase the pressure on neighboring countries, even European countries. Such developments would also have negative economic consequences, as economic activities would be disrupted, poverty and unemployment rates would surge. Such tensions would lead to an increase in oil prices if maritime navigation routes and energy sources were affected. Madam President, Iraq condemned statements and threats by the Prime Minister of the Israeli Occupation Authority against countries of the region. Such escalatory statements fuel conflicts and push the region towards more tension and war. Such public threats are not only provocative, they also constitute a clear violation to the principles of international law and the United Nations Charter, which prescribe the threat of use of force against sovereign states. In conclusion, Madam President, Iraq expresses its full solidarity with the just cause of the Palestinian people. We strongly support its aspirations to be granted its rights to establish an independent state, with Al-Quds Sharif as its capital. Iraq expresses its support and solidarity with the government and people of Lebanon against the barbaric attacks that violate the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Lebanon. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Iraq for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, allow me at the outset to congratulate you on your assumption of the presidency of the Security Council this month. I thank your predecessor for conducting the work of the Security Council last month. I would also like to thank the Secretary General of the United Nations for participating and being with us today in this session. We stand in solidarity with him in the face of the Israeli campaigns against him. Madam President, for the past months, the Security Council held successive sessions to discuss the continued Israeli aggression on the Palestinian people and on the countries of our region. We would not have gotten here. We would not be holding this emergency session and maybe other sessions in the next days had your council shouldered its main responsibility in the maintenance of international peace and security since the beginning of the barbaric Israeli aggression on Gaza. The majority of leaders and representatives of member states who spoke at the General Assembly in the past few days during the high-level general debate, they called upon the Security Council to take immediate action to stop the barbaric Israeli aggression on the Palestinian people and to stop the repeated Israeli attacks on the states of the region, to implement its resolutions to end the Israeli occupation of Arab-occupied territories, to stop its continued crimes which started decades ago. Their statements reflected a genuine international will to put an end to the impunity of the Israeli occupation entity and its obsession with war and bloodshed. All these calls were met by Israeli war criminals continuing their criminal aggression in Palestine, Syria, and Lebanon, showing off their violations of international law and the UN Charter. They have been leveling accusations against our organization and trying to terrorize its representatives and agencies, including UNRWA. We meet today as our region is on the brink of an all-out destructive war that can spare no one. It is no longer acceptable for the Security Council response to be limited to holding session after session without adopting any product that could lead to a serious and tangible action. To be more specific, the reluctance of the United States to stop this Israeli madness, but rather supporting and encouraging it, while preventing the Security Council to shoulder its responsibility, namely to maintain international peace and security, is what got us to this dangerous situation. The U.S. administration cannot deny its responsibility by making statements to express concern, or warning against dangerous escalation, or calling for restraint, at a time when it continues to provide unlimited, multifaceted support to the Israeli occupation entity, vowing to protect it from accountability and ensuring its impunity. Madam President, it was not enough for the Israeli occupation authorities to see the tens of thousands of lives they have killed, to see the bloodshed, to see the infrastructure they destroyed in occupied Palestine. They continued the escalation in the region, pushing it towards a full-on war by continuing their attacks on the states of the region, including my country, Syria. The Israeli occupation forces launched repeated attacks targeting civilians in safe areas, targeting civilian infrastructure and residential buildings, even targeting diplomatic premises. The latest attack on Monday targeted a number of safe residential neighborhoods and regions in Damascus with drones and airstrikes, killing 3 civilians, including 1 journalist, and injuring 7 others, while also causing tremendous property damage. A few minutes ago, another Israeli aggression targeted a residential building in Damascus, leading to the killing of 3 people and injuring others. Those are the preliminary numbers. In brotherly Lebanon, the criminal occupation authorities used civilian communication equipment to conduct mass killing. And then they mobilized their forces in preparation of an incursion. They targeted a number of residential buildings in the southern suburb of Beirut in order to assassinate the Secretary General of Hezbollah, who led an honorable Lebanese national resistance against the Israeli occupation. All these different forms of the barbaric Israeli occupation on our region were also perpetrated during the General Assembly, during the high-level week of the General Assembly, which reflects Israel's contempt for our organization and the calls of its member states. The so-called Israeli Prime Minister boasted about taking the decision of attacking the southern Beirut suburb from here in New York, following a propaganda campaign full of misleading lies that he launched during his statement, while the majority of delegations refused to listen to him. The Syrian Arab Republic condemns all the continued Israeli aggression on the states of the region. We call upon the Security Council to take immediate action to put an end to the Israeli impunity, which is setting the region on fire, which is threatening international and regional peace and security. We reaffirm our legitimate right to defend our people and land, to fight these crimes with all the means guaranteed by the international law. We also reaffirm that we stand with the Palestinian and Lebanese people. We fully support them, despite the grave challenges facing Syria, caused by the aggressive policies adopted by Western states in service of Israel, and despite the illegitimate coercive measures and inhumane blockade imposed on Syria, Syria will spare no effort to provide humanitarian assistance to our brothers and sisters in Lebanon. We have mobilized as a government and civil society all our energy and resources to help all those coming from Lebanon, be they Syrian, Lebanese, or from other nationalities. Madam President, Article 51 of the Charter stipulated the legitimate right of states to self-defense. This is an inherent right for people and states, and the Israeli occupation entity does not have it. This was stressed by the ICJ because occupation and the aggression it represents is the basic crime which deprives its perpetrators from any rights. The inaction of the Security Council allowed the Israeli occupation entity to cross all red lines, pushing the Islamic Republic of Iran to practice its legitimate right to self-defense based on Article 51 of the Charter in response to the aggression of the Israeli occupation entity. The Iranian response came after a long period of self-restraint and attempts to prevent further escalation. The Iranian response was limited to military and security facilities. This stresses Iran's responsible approach regarding international and regional peace and security. We were not surprised to hear the representative of the U.S. administration and a number of her alliances criticize the Iranian response. These states look at the Charter as a tool that they use at their own whims to target their foes and protect their partners. We have listened time and again to the representatives of successive U.S. administrations presenting false and distorted interpretations of Article 51 of the Charter to justify aggression on states that are thousands and thousands of miles away, to occupy their land, to loot their resources under the pretext of quote-unquote protecting or maintaining national U.S. security or fighting terrorism, while prohibiting other states from practicing their legitimate right to self-defense at their immediate borders in the face of a genuine aggression against them. In conclusion, Madam President, the representatives of member states who took the floor and spoke at the General Assembly in the last few days have spoken. It is now high time for the Security Council to listen, to take urgent and serious steps to stop the continuing suffering in Gaza, to stop the bloodshed in the region, to put an immediate and unconditional end to the Israeli aggression on Palestine, Syria, and Lebanon, to stop and end the Israeli occupation of Arab territories by implementing the relevant Security Council resolutions. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic, and I give the floor to the representative of Italy.
Madam President, let me first congratulate you for assuming the presidency in this month of October, and also to thank the Secretary General for his briefing and his work. Italy firmly condemns yesterday's Iranian missile attack on Israel. We express deep concern for the ongoing developments and call for restraint and responsibility on all regional actors. Avoiding any further spiral of escalations has to be our common priority, our top priority, as well as preventing another dramatic humanitarian outburst. Italy will continue to work for a diplomatic solution, also in its capacity as the G7 rotating president, for the stabilization of the Israeli-Lebanese border, and in this regard strongly recalls the leaders' declaration of September 25 for a 21-day ceasefire in Lebanon. And while we are gathering now, our Prime Minister is about to host a call of the leaders of the G7 to discuss the situation in the region. Italy calls on all parties involved for the full implementation of Resolution 1701 and invites the Security Council to consider to make the implementation of UNIFIL's mandate more effective, with a view to ensure the security along the Blue Line and to grant the displaced population of northern Israel and Lebanon to safely return home. The security of all UNIFIL personnel has to be respected and fully guaranteed. Sovereignty and territorial integrity of Lebanon needs also to be respected. Madam President, Italy calls for an immediate ceasefire in Lebanon. We will continue to work for a diplomatic solution, and we are ready to assist the Lebanese armed forces in assuming their responsibilities along the border with Israel. To such extent, Italy also deems of utmost importance to fully support and revamp the Lebanon-Israel negotiations to peacefully establish their borders. We will continue to engage with our partners and allies and to keep open channels of dialogue with all the actors in the region. At the same time, it is equally urgent to reach an agreement for a ceasefire in Gaza and to release the hostages in line with Resolution 2735. At this specific time, it is our collective responsibility to call for calm and restraint, aware of the fact that every minute that goes by, the lives of innocent men, women, and children of the entire region hang in the balance. Italy is a firm supporter of the principle two peoples, two states, and shares the goal of a comprehensive, lasting regional peace that can ultimately be achieved on the basis of a two-state solution, with Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace and security within agreed, recognized borders, and full recognition of Israel's existence and respect of its security by all regional actors. I thank you.
Merci, le représentant.
I thank the representative of Italy. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. I would like to warmly thank the Secretary General, and I now invite members of the Council to informal consultations on the subject. The meeting is adjourned.
This was the first time we see as a journalist live genocide. Do you know the mental effects it has done on us?
Imagine what it's done to them.
This is the first time as a journalist we saw live genocide in the past.
Not the first time. It's the first time that we're constantly see Sudan. Not live, not live, not live. But we knew about it.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Just a brief announcement before we get started. Thank you. This morning, in advance of the President's call with the G7 leaders, the Secretary convened a call of the foreign ministers from France, Germany, Italy, and the United Kingdom. On that call, he discussed with them working together to coordinate a response to Iran's attack on Israel. Further discussed how to coordinate diplomatic efforts moving forward to ensure stability in the Middle East. Secretary then joined the President's call with the G7. I'm sure you saw the readout that the White House issued a short time ago, where they made clear that the G7 condemns Iran's attack on Israel and is working together on a response, including new sanctions. With that, Matt. Not Matt.
I'll be Matt today.
Really? Go ahead.
So Biden said he does not support an attack on Iran's nuclear sites. Is that a red line for the U.S., and are there any others? What's your message to Israel on how this response should look?
So the President made very clear what we do not support. I think beyond that, we will continue to discuss with Israel what the shape of their response will be. I'm not going to air all of those discussions privately, but we have made very clear that this was an unprecedented escalation by Iran. Israel has a right to respond to it, and we'll discuss that response with them.
Are the Israelis listening to you? Do you have any indications that Israel is even inclined to listen to the U.S. after having made operational decisions on its own that led to success?
Look, they're a sovereign country. They do make their own decisions. We talk with them at a number of different levels about what we believe is in their interest, what we believe is in the interest of the region. We'll continue to do that, but ultimately it's up for them, as it is for any sovereign country, to make their own decisions.
Are they receptive to what you've been telling them in these conversations, though? Do you have any indication that they're going to listen or coordinate with you on what the next steps are?
I think it's appropriate at this point that we keep those conversations private.
And then just on Gaza ceasefire prospects, has there been any progress on that since the attack on Hezbollah communications equipment? Are there any meetings taking place? Is there a path forward for that at this point, or has that been overtaken by Israel and Hezbollah?
It's not that it's been overtaken by the conflict between Israel and Hezbollah. It's that Hamas has, again, refused to engage. I went through some of this yesterday, and I'm happy to go through it again. This really predates the events of the past week, 10 days, where we've seen Israel launching attacks on increased attacks on Hezbollah. It goes back several weeks where we were at this point where we were trying to get together a next proposal that we, along with the other mediators, Egypt and Qatar, would present to the two parties. And in preparing for that step, we're doing various soundings of what might be agreeable, trying to play the role of a mediator and come up with a response that would get to yes on both sides. And Hamas has refused to engage. So it's not from a lack of interest on our part, it's not from a lack of focus on our part, but when you're trying to put together a deal, you have to have the parties themselves engage. And over the last few weeks, Hamas has been unwilling for whatever reason to engage. So, go ahead. You seated your right, yeah.
Well, I was late, I'm sorry. I was on the call.
Just to bounce off Gaza, Israel is still, they don't have as many troops in Gaza at the moment, given their movement of a lot of troops up north. They are still doing operations in Gaza. Can you give us any kind of update on what their next steps are in Gaza in terms of like any kind of transition phase? Is there anything that they like in terms of what their plan is, if there are no communications with Hamas? I know that a lot of this is under wraps, but any kind of how the US is pivoting.
I think they should speak for what their next plans are. Obviously, we have been clear about what we believe the post-conflict period should look like in Gaza, but when it comes to what Israel's plans are, it's something that they should speak to.
Okay, and on Lebanon, you mentioned yesterday the number of Americans who have registered with the U.S. Embassy to get information in case they should want to leave. Do you have an update on numbers and any update on any U.S. assistance for helping those Americans to leave?
Yeah, so there are now around 7,000 people who have contacted us. Not all of those are looking for assistance to leave, but we ask people to register with us for more information, and then we provide them information. Some of those, I presume, will eventually look to depart Lebanon, and some of them will want to stay, but their plans may change over time. Their interests may change over time. That's the number of people who have registered with us. In terms of the U.S. helping people leave the country, for the past several days, we have been working, or past really going back September 28th, we have been working to make seats available or to find seats available on existing commercial flights. We have been able to identify over 800 seats over that time. A number of them have been used by American citizens. Not in all cases have they been filled. And then today we were able to organize a flight from Beirut to Istanbul to allow other American citizens to leave. It's been a priority for us to enhance the capacity of flights in and out of the region, so we've contracted with additional carriers to facilitate the transport of American citizens. There was a flight that left a couple of hours ago from Beirut, had a capacity of 300, had somewhere a little over 100 American citizens and their family members who departed on it.
Okay, thank you. And just one final question. There's been reports of an American citizen killed in Lebanon. Can you give us any?
We have seen those reports. It's our understanding that it was a legal permanent resident, not an American citizen. But we obviously offer our sincerest condolences to the family on their loss.
Sorry, just on the flight.
Yeah.
Flights, excuse me, from Lebanon, from Beirut. There was just one flight today?
Just one flight today. And I should add...
To Istanbul.
Let me just add for context. We do hope to organize additional flights in the coming days, depending on demand. If there is demand for those flights, we hope to organize additional flights. I won't be able to announce them in advance because oftentimes you understand, of course, how difficult the situation is, and times that we'll hope to have flights and won't be able to get them in or out for whatever reason. But I will be able to, after they have occurred, come here and talk about them.
Okay, and then you said since September 28th, you managed to secure about 800 seats on existing flights, not contract
correct,
flights.
Existing flights.
Right. But you don't have any idea how many people actually took advantage of those seats?
I don't. I can try to follow up after the briefing and see if we can get the exact number.
Those are all, those 800, so 100 seats that you had secured were on Middle East Airlines?
Correct. It's the only commercial carrier currently flying out of Beirut.
Okay, and are there plans for more of these contract flights?
We are going to look to organize them in the coming days. We're going to keep trying to do both lines of effort. Identify seats on existing commercial flights, and then to the extent there is demand, and we do expect there will be demand at least for the next several days, and then we'll monitor as we go forward. We do expect to organize additional flights out of Beirut.
Okay, and then when you mentioned earlier about the Secretary's call this morning with the Quint, I believe it was.
Correct.
I'm sorry, I missed that.
Yep.
You also said that you guys are still in touch at a variety of levels with the Israeli government. In terms of the Secretary's conversations, when was the last time he spoke to either his counterpart or Ron Dermer, or was it last week?
Yesterday.
In New York?
Yesterday.
Yesterday. Okay. So, and what was the result of that?
So the Secretary, along with other members of the administration, had a number of phone calls with the Israeli government yesterday. Obviously, the Secretary was joined the President virtually from here during the attack to monitor the attack, and then participated in a number of calls with senior Israeli government officials. We are talking with them about their response and what their response will look like. Those conversations are ongoing, and I think I'll leave it at that.
Okay, so that last contact was when they were all in the Situation Room, when we all could see on TV the Iranian missiles coming in. It was after that.
So on the margins of that, I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
Okay, and then, but so far today, you're not aware of any.
No, not as of this point, which isn't to say that we won't have any. And I should make clear that sometimes we read these calls out, and oftentimes we don't.
All right, and then just back to, because I realized I forgot to ask it. Do you have, whether it was on these flights from the 28th from last week, and plus the 100 or so who were on this other flight today, do you have any idea of how many American citizens have actually left?
I don't. I can see if we can get that information. On the flight today, it was somewhere a little over 100, but those aren't all American citizens. Some of those are American citizens. Some of them are family members who are not American citizens.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Yeah, Saeed.
Political reports that the U.S. officials quietly supported the escalation in Lebanon, including apparently the assassination of Hezbollah chief Nasrallah. Could you comment on that?
So we were not aware of that attack, that incident, before it happened. So we could not possibly quietly support something of which we were not aware. Now, to be clear, we support bringing Hassan Nasrallah to justice. That is true. We've made clear that he's a brutal terrorist with the blood of Americans, the blood of Israelis, the blood of Lebanese, Syrians on his hands. So we do support, but in advance, we weren't aware of that. So possible to support something that you didn't know was happening.
Okay, so you were not aware of the logistics, but you are supportive of the action.
Well, I don't know what you mean by logistics.
Okay,
we were not aware before it happened.
Time and place and method. Those are the logistics. Okay, but let me just ask you a follow-up to a question that I asked yesterday that relates to what you're saying. I mean, Matt, I was in this room in March 2004 when Israel assassinated Sheikh Yassin. 2 months later, when they assassinated Rantisi. Probably around this town when they assassinated Busiri. I mean, there's a record of assassinations, and that has not gotten Israel anywhere. What we see that Hamas has gotten much stronger. Hezbollah has gotten a lot stronger. It seems that they are doing everything except looking at the cause of the problem, which is the occupation, a military occupation of a people that it's been overdue for them to be free from the yoke of occupation. Do you agree with that?
So I spoke to this in response to a nearly identical question from you yesterday, and I will make clear, look, obviously there is a long history of conflict in this region, and we will continue to make clear that Israel has the right and the responsibility to defend itself from terrorism. It is the same right that every country has, and every country, if it had a terrorist just across the border, a terrorist organization just across from its borders attacking it, would take action to defend itself. I don't think that is a innovative or should be even a controversial statement. But we also are very clear that we believe the long-term way to ensure stability in the region, and really the short-term way too, is the establishment of an independent Palestinian state. We made quite clear. That's been the position of the United States for some time, and it is the position of this administration.
Okay, so you agree then that Israel has an obligation to end this occupation. It's time to end this occupation and allow people to have their own freedoms, their own level of integrity, measure of integrity that, like the president.
We absolutely do want to see the establishment of an independent Palestinian state where Palestinians can choose their own future. Now, that while that obviously requires some very important steps by Israel, and it requires a change of direction from the government of Israel, there are steps that would require the Palestinians to take as well.
Okay, one last question. Senator Graham, and apparently there's been much talk about this, is saying that we should take out Iran's oil facilities and so on. Is that a good idea? Would that, create, total chaos and maybe similar retaliatory for something that is really a major U.S. interest?
So we are discussing with Israel the scope and nature of their response, and I think I'll leave those discussions private. Yeah, go ahead. I'll come to you next, Tom. Go ahead. I'll just kind of work my way left to right.
Is the U.S. response to the attacks yesterday by Iran limited to sanctions? And if so, what sanctions are there left to levy against Iran at this point?
So we can always look to identify new ways to impose sanctions on Iran or to increase enforcement of our existing sanctions. Those are the measures that we're looking at right now. You saw it in the president's statement. That's what he made clear we, along with the G7, are considering. When we see Iran take new actions, we work with our partners to identify new ways to respond to that. And I think I should make clear, and this is clear, I think, from the statement the president put out, it's not just a question of U.S. sanctions. It is a question of other entities, some of which don't have as strong a sanctions regime as the U.S. has imposed, taking their own measures as well. Yeah.
Just briefly first, Israel Katz's statement this morning that Antonio Guterres would be banned from entering Israel. Do you have any response to that?
I don't find that, we don't find that step to be productive in any way.
I wanted to ask you, I mean, we're getting on to a year now from October the 7th. When you reflect on a year of U.S. diplomacy when it comes to Israel and Gaza, how do you characterize what you have and haven't accomplished in that time?
So there have been a number of things. If you go back and look at the statements that the Secretary made and that others in the administration made in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, there were a number of lines of effort and strategic goals that we identified. One of them is to ensure that Israel has the ability to defend itself against terrorism. And we have worked hard to establish that right and to support Israel in defending itself against terrorism. Another is to ensure that humanitarian access makes it to citizens in Gaza who needed it. And now, of course, that applies to people in Lebanon as well. But we've made clear we want to see humanitarian access get into Gaza. And while that, of course, has been a very difficult process and with lots of hurdles and obstacles, I think it's through the intervention and the involvement and the hard work of the United States that we've been able to get humanitarian assistance into those in Gaza, which is not to say that this is whenever I talk about this, I never want to make it sound like it is a game over, mission accomplished. It is very much not. It's an ongoing process. We were constantly having to break through new hurdles and find additional ways to get humanitarian assistance in. The other, one of the overarching goals that we identified is try to keep the conflict from spreading and really turning into an all-out regional war. And we have faced a number of days in the nearly year since October 7th where that goal seemed incredibly difficult and the situation was incredibly fraught. And through a combination of diplomacy and deterrence, we have been able to calm tensions when they've been threatening to spiral out of control. And prevent the outbreak of an all-out regional war. And now, obviously, is one of those times where we're, again, at a very fraught moment, and we're going to continue to pursue diplomacy and deterrence to try and prevent escalation into that full conflagration.
I mean, you're very well aware of the very loud criticism there has been, particularly over humanitarian aid and on the failure to reach a ceasefire and hostage release deal. But, I mean, on that final point about regional war, it feels much closer now than it has been. I mean, do you see this process in your diplomacy over the last year as a success?
So I will say, with respect to the question about all-out regional war, I was getting those same kinds of questions in April when it looked like we might be very close to a direct war between Israel and Iran. And I made clear at the time, and others in the administration made clear at the time, that while we never make any predictions about what the future is going to hold, we were going to spend all of our time working through diplomacy, through deterrence, through the relationships that we have built with our partners in the region to try and prevent an outbreak of that full regional conflict, and we were successful then, and we're continuing to pursue that today. It's not to say that tensions aren't high. Obviously, this is a region where tensions have been high going back decades. It's not something that started on October 7th. It's not something that that started at the beginning of this administration. So I will let others pass judgment on the success of our efforts. I will say that from our standpoint, we will continue to work to try to advance those goals. And I would also say when it comes to getting humanitarian assistance into Gaza, yes, of course, the results have not been sufficient. The outcomes have not been sufficient. There are things that we're trying to improve all the time. But it is because of the United States involvement that we got humanitarian assistance in the first place, that we've seen it increase at various times, that we've seen it sustained, and it is through our continued involvement that we will try to address obstacles as they come up. I'll say with respect to a ceasefire, yes, it has been a major priority of the United States to get to a ceasefire, but that requires the two parties themselves to come to the table. And there have been times when Israel has thrown up obstacles that have made it difficult, and we've been working through those and applying all the diplomacy we can to try and overcome those obstacles. And there have been times that Hamas has been the obstacle. And obviously, we don't have a lot of influence on Hamas's decision-making process. There are others that do, Iran chiefly, and it's I would hope that others in the region would step up to the plate as well. Obviously, that's not what we've seen them do.
And finally, I just wanted to put to you, Ronald Reagan's diary entry for August the 12th, 1982 describes how he phoned Prime Minister Begin of Israel and told him to stop bombing Beirut or the US-Israel relationship would be endangered. I mean, to the accusation that you have simply not used leverage to get what you want, what do you say to that? And bearing in mind some precedents like that.
So there have been a number of times over the course of this conflict where direct U.S. intervention with the government of Israel has led them to take steps that they were not previously doing, to take steps when it comes to humanitarian access, to take steps with regards to the shape of their military operations. I'm not going to speak to all those publicly. Some of them have been reported over time. But I do think it is often simplistic to reduce the calculus of other countries, to reduce the understanding of what's happening to the bilateral relationship between any two countries. Every country in this region is a sovereign country that makes their own decisions based on their interest. That was true before October 7th. That remains true. The United States will continue to work to advance its own interests. Will continue to work to advance peace, advance stability in the region. But ultimately, all of the countries in the region, this includes Israel, this includes other countries, make their own decisions. They're responsible for their own decisions. They're responsible for the consequences of those decisions.
I mean, Reagan did stop the bombing. Begin stopped it 20 minutes later.
Now, I think we have made clear on a number of occasions with the government of Israel what we believe. And there have been times when our intervention has led to direct action by the government of Israel. There are times when they have disagreements with us. And by the way, that was true in the Reagan administration, too. There's no administration that you look back through history will tell you that they have a perfect record in influencing any other country's behavior or decision-making. There are times when we make our opinion known to the government of Israel and they act on it. There are times they disagree. It's true with other countries, and that was true in other administrations, both with Israel and other countries as well. Alex, go ahead.
Thank you,
and I'll keep going.
I understand you don't want to talk about sanctions, but to help us understand its scope, what is the ultimate goal, the targeted goal in it? Is it just to express your anger or to actually take away from the capability?
So I'm not going to really, you're right, I'm not going to discuss sanctions that we have not yet announced. You saw the president make the statement today that we are working with the G7 on sanctions, but our goal continues to be to hold Iran accountable, and they are one tool in our diplomatic arsenal. We'll continue to use them.
May I ask about Ukraine? Is it,
sure. Or why don't we do this? Why don't we keep going and we'll come back to Ukraine? Yeah.
I have several questions on Iran and Lebanon. First, on Iran, why is the U.S. against Israel attacking their nuclear sites?
So we have made clear for some time that we do not want to see a full-blown regional escalation. Israel has a right to respond to what happened yesterday. It was an unprecedented action by Iran to launch nearly 200 ballistic missiles at Israel, a state-on-state attack, the likes of which we haven't seen directed against Israel from Iran. And so Israel, of course, has a response. And we are going to continue to discuss with them what that response might look like, but we don't want to see any action that would lead to a full-blown regional war.
And on Lebanon, are you talking to Israel to keep the airport open and not bombing it?
So I'm not going to talk about any specific site, but we have made clear to Israel that we do not want to see civilian infrastructure targeted. We don't want to see, obviously, civilian sites targeted. The airport is playing a crucial function in helping get American citizens out of Lebanon, as well as citizens of other countries who want to be able to leave, and we think it's important that the airport stay open for those purposes.
And did you understand from them the scope of their military operations in Lebanon and their goals or goals there?
So we have obviously had a number of conversations with them about that, but I don't think it's appropriate for me to speak to those conversations. Those are private consultations between our two countries. To the extent they want to publicly discuss their operations in Lebanon, I think it's appropriate for them to do so, but it wouldn't be appropriate for me to do so from here.
Is the ceasefire offer still on the table, or it's already...
We ultimately do want to see a ceasefire that leads to a diplomatic resolution. That has been, we have been clear that that's how we see this conflict ending. Now, we do support Israel's right to target members of Hezbollah, to target Hezbollah infrastructure, but yes, we do want to see a diplomatic resolution.
And my final question, do you trust the UNIFIL and the Lebanese army to implement the 1701 UN Security Council resolution in the future?
We do believe they are both very important actors for ensuring stability, for ensuring the full implementation of that resolution. Obviously, if you look at the long history since that resolution was adopted, we've seen Hezbollah refuse to comply with its obligations. And so we would call, again, as we have over many years, going back, predating this administration, for Hezbollah to pull back from the border, to comply with the requirements of 1701. And UNIFIL and the Lebanese Armed Forces play a very important role in ultimately implementing that resolution. I would just say, the only thing I would say is that we are in the middle of a dynamic situation right now. Obviously, for some years, you've seen this difficult situation where the LAF and UNIFIL were not fully able to enforce that resolution because of the presence of Hezbollah forces who just refused to fulfill their obligations. We are in a dynamic situation right now. It's hard to say how it's going to shake out, but look, ultimately, what we want to see is that resolution implemented.
Thank you.
Yeah.
First, I want to press you on your answer to Tom. Israel declaring the Secretary General of the United Nations a persona non grata. We're not talking about the head of UNRWA. We're talking about the head of the UN itself. You said, your answer to him, you said that's not productive. You don't think that this is delegitimize an international body that provides an essential work, humanitarian work for civilians during this current war, whether it's in Gaza or Lebanon?
But we don't think it's a productive step at all, precisely because of the reasons you identify, which is the UN does incredibly important work in Gaza. It does incredibly important work in the region, and the UN, when it's acting at its best, can play an important role for security and stability. So we think it's important that Israel be able to engage with the UN. One of the things we've always said that Israel needs to be cognizant of throughout this conflict is its standing in the world. And steps like this are not productive to improving its standing in the world.
Sure, but do you condemn it? I mean, my point is, can you use any leverage to reverse this decision?
So I have made clear. I don't always like when people put other words in my mind or in my mouth. I've made quite clear what we think about this, and let's see what happens moving forward.
Okay. The second question is. The Secretary and you often say that Israel has the right to defend itself, but how it does it, it matters. So this morning, there were 6 first responders were killed in Lebanon, civilians. In Gaza, it's over 40,000, 70% are women and children. In Lebanon, is 1 million people are homeless. So when he says how it matters, if there's no consequences in Israel, doesn't his word carry no weight? Does it mean that it's really a statement for public consumption?
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. Look, wars have horrific consequences. They always have. They always will. And these wars have had horrific consequences for the people of Gaza and now for the people of Lebanon. It is why the U.S. has worked so hard to try to reach a diplomatic resolution to the conflict in Lebanon. And what you saw going back months is Hezbollah refusing to stop its attacks on civilian targets inside Israel. It's why we've tried to reach a ceasefire agreement in Gaza that would ultimately lead to the guns being silenced, hostages coming home, humanitarian assistance surging in. We will continue to pursue both of those things. But in each of these cases, it is just a little more complicated than the question concedes. It is more complicated when you have terrorist groups that hide inside civilians. When you look at the death of Hassan Nasrallah last week, where was he? Was he on a military compound? Was he on a compound that Hezbollah built where there were only members of Hezbollah? No, he was underneath a civilian apartment building. And when you look at what has happened over and over again in Gaza, you've seen Hamas hiding not just in apartment buildings, but mosques and schools. Now, we've been very clear with Israel that doesn't lessen their obligation to do everything possible to be mindful, to minimize and reduce and eliminate civilian casualties, but it is an extremely tough situation. It's every military in the world would face extremely challenging circumstances trying to take on a terrorist organization that was committed to targeting civilians, not just targeting members of the military, but targeting civilians. And at the same time, they do it hiding among civilians. That's what makes the situation so difficult.
And just finally, do you see this current escalation and a military conflict as a result of U.S. failed diplomacy, or is it Netanyahu's government trying to drag the U.S. into a bigger war?
So again, it's a little bit of a simplistic question about a complicated situation. There are two parties to this conflict. Israel is one party to this conflict, and Hezbollah is the other party to this conflict. When you look at the conflict in the north, it's a conflict that Hezbollah started on October 8th, that they could have ended any day since then. It's not a conflict that Israel starts, it's a conflict that Hezbollah started that they could have stopped by stopping firing rockets. So I will say, as I said in response to an earlier question, we've been at similar situations over the past 12 months where situations were incredibly high and it looked like we might get into a full-scale war. And the combination of our deterrence and diplomacy and the hard work, not just of the United States, but our allies and partners in the region has been successful in preventing that from happening, which is never a prediction of future success. But to us, it tells us that we ought to stay